Chapter 1. An Unexpected Encounter. The sun was a distant speck in the Nyraxis sky, barely casting light on the snow-laden surface of the planet. Shylith shivered, her fur-lined robes doing little against the biting cold as she clung to the shadows of the crumbling structure around her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her ears twitching at every distant sound. She had to remain quiet, hidden, or else they would find her. The raiders had descended upon her small settlement at dawn, a band of rough, towering figures draped in dark, layered armor. They had stormed through her village, setting fire to homes, taking supplies, and dragging those who tried to resist into the freezing open. Shylith had barely escaped into the wilderness, her legs burning as she sprinted through the thick snow. But now, hidden in an ancient, abandoned watchtower on the outskirts of her village, she thought she was safe. The icy walls had provided some shelter, and though she was alone, she had evaded the raiders' brutal search. At least, that's what she thought until she heard the rumble of metal groaning and a sharp crack splitting the silence, followed by a thunderous crash. Shylith's heart leapt as she peered cautiously from her hiding place, her large, almond-shaped eyes catching a glimpse of something enormous falling from the sky. She watched as a metal object, streaked with flames, plummeted down, hitting the ground with such force that the earth itself seemed to quake. Snow and dust kicked up around the crash site, obscuring whatever strange object had fallen. Curiosity overpowered her fear. Shylith edged forward, her gaze locked on the massive crater left in the object's wake. She had heard stories of starships giant, winged beasts that carried the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy. Her heart froze as she remembered tales of humans, the terrifying race that consumed other beings without hesitation. Her people had whispered of their strength, their brutality, and most of all, their hunger for flesh. Shylith took a hesitant step back, but it was too late. She heard movement from the crash site. A tall figure emerged, backlit by the flickering remnants of flames. The being's shape was unmistakable, bulky and clad in a suit of armor that shimmered with strange lights. His helmet was sleek, covering his face, and he held an object in one hand, long and deadly looking. In terror, she huddled against the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. She prayed he wouldn't see her, that he would go away and leave her to her solitude. But fate had other plans. As if sensing her presence, the figure turned, his visor reflecting the dim light, and started toward her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Closer he came, each step slow, deliberate, and Shylith's mind whirled with all the stories her elders had told her of humans, of how they devoured their prey raw, how they feasted on creatures who dared cross their path. As he approached, she shut her eyes tight, expecting claws, teeth, something terrible to be her end. But instead, she felt something entirely unexpected, a warm, gentle touch on her shoulder. Slowly, she opened her eyes to see him kneeling in front of her, his helmet removed to reveal a face unlike anything she had imagined. His eyes, a strange, piercing blue, held no malice, only concern. He spoke in a voice low and soothing, though she couldn't understand the words. "Are you all right?" the man asked, the words foreign to her ears but somehow comforting. His tone was filled with kindness, rather than the cruelty she had expected. He extended a gloved hand, offering her a small, round object. Hesitantly, she accepted it, her trembling fingers grazing his palm. It was food, a small, packaged bar that emitted warmth and smelled faintly sweet. Shylith blinked, her mind grappling to process what was happening. He wasn't here to eat her. Instead, he was offering her sustenance. Her fear melted into confusion, and a part of her, hidden beneath layers of instinctive distrust, felt a flicker of gratitude. The human began speaking again, pointing to himself. "Connor," he said slowly, tapping his chest, his eyes watching her closely, waiting for a reaction. She stared at him, her mind turning over the strange syllables. Connor, was this his name? She managed to nod, still wary but intrigued by the strange creature before her. Connor continued to talk in his unfamiliar language, though she couldn't grasp his meaning. Yet, his gestures were clear. He was trying to communicate, to understand her. He pointed to her injured leg, which had been scraped during her escape. Gently, he pulled out a small vial and a cloth from his pack, dabbing her wound with a blue liquid that stung at first but quickly turned soothingly cool. The minutes ticked by as he tended to her, his focus entirely on her well-being. Shyleth couldn't help but stare, marveling at this strange twist of fate. Here was the very creature her people had deemed a predator, yet he was healing her, feeding her, offering her protection. The sounds of raiders echoing in the distance jolted them both back to reality. Connor looked over his shoulder, his expression turning steely as he heard the distant voices drawing closer. Shyleth's breath hitched. They had found her again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Connor held up his hand, signaling her to stay hidden. With swift, fluid movements, he pulled a sleek device from his belt, activating it with a soft hum. He glanced at her, his blue eyes reassuring, as if silently promising he would keep her safe. Then, with a nod, he moved out of sight, blending into the shadows, leaving Shyleth's heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange, unfamiliar hope. As she waited, listening to the faint echoes of Connor moving stealthily to intercept the raiders, she realized something astonishing. She was no longer afraid of him. In fact, she was silently praying he would return, that he would be the one to drive away her nightmares and save her village. Chapter 2. A Frightening Alliance. Shyleth's heart hammered in her chest as she waited in the eerie silence, gripping the small bar of food Connor had given her. She strained her ears, picking up distant voices, the unmistakable snarls and shouts of the raiders. She imagined Connor out there in the icy landscape, standing between her and the merciless beings who had ravaged her village. She barely knew him, yet an inexplicable sense of trust had bloomed within her, fueled by his unexpected kindness. After what felt like an eternity, she heard footsteps approaching. Her first instinct was to shrink back, fearing it might be one of the raiders. But then she saw him, Connor, his figure emerging from the shadows. He looked back over his shoulder, his face set with determination. He had bought them some time. Connor gestured for her to follow, his movements quick but careful, indicating they needed to leave before the raiders returned. Shyleth hesitated, glancing back toward her village, but the destruction she had witnessed flashed in her mind. She knew there was nothing left for her there, at least for now. Taking a deep breath, she nodded, pushing herself to her feet, and followed him into the bleak, frozen wilderness. The journey was treacherous. The landscape of Nyraxis was a sprawling expanse of ice and jagged rock formations, stretching as far as the eye could see. The cold seeped into her bones, and every gust of wind bit into her exposed skin, making her shiver despite her thick robes. Connor, clad in his advanced, insulated suit, didn't seem as affected by the cold, but he kept a close eye on her, ensuring she could keep up. They walked in silence, communicating through gestures. Every so often, Connor would stop, scanning the horizon with his strange device, which emitted a soft glow as he pressed buttons and checked readings. Shyleth didn't understand its purpose, but she trusted his expertise. Whatever he was doing, it was keeping them out of the raiders' path. After hours of trekking through the unforgiving terrain, they found shelter in a small cavern. Connor set up a portable heater, filling the cave with a faint warmth that felt almost miraculous to Shyleth. He gestured for her to sit and handed her another ration bar, which she accepted with a grateful nod. The food was foreign, but its taste was strangely pleasant, with a sweetness that lingered on her tongue. As they sat in the warmth of the heater, Connor reached into his bag and pulled out a small, handheld device with a holographic display. Shyleth watched as he tapped on the screen, bringing up images of planets, stars, and strange, foreign symbols. He seemed to be searching for something, his brows knitted in concentration. Then, he turned the device toward her, pointing to an image of a distant star system. He spoke in his language, slow and careful, repeating the same words several times, Earth. Shyleth tilted her head, trying to grasp the meaning. After a moment, she realized he was showing her where he came from. Connor's eyes softened as he watched her reaction, and he pointed to himself again, repeating, human. Shyleth nodded, the syllable strange but manageable on her tongue. Human, she repeated, and his face broke into a slight smile, the first she had seen from him. In return, she placed her hand on her chest, her voice barely a whisper as she said, Nyraxi. Shyleth. She was surprised by how willingly she had shared her name, as if trusting him felt like a natural thing to do. Connor's gaze softened further, and he gave her a slight nod of acknowledgement. Their fragile peace, however, was soon disrupted by a sound that sent a chill down Shylith's spine, the faint echo of voices and the heavy clank of metal. The raiders were nearby. Connor's face turned grim. He gestured for Shylith to stay low and silent. With practiced efficiency, he packed up his gear and turned off the heater, leaving only the faintest trace of warmth in the air. He motioned for her to follow him deeper into the cave, leading them to a narrow crevice that they could barely squeeze through. As they huddled in the cramped space, Connor withdrew a sleek, metallic device, a weapon, she assumed. He positioned himself between her and the cave entrance, his body tense, ready to act if the raiders discovered them. Shylith's heart raced as she watched him, a mixture of fear and awe flooding her senses. He had come to protect her, despite being a stranger on her world. The raiders' voices grew louder, echoing through the cavern, and Shylith held her breath, praying they would pass by. But then she saw a flicker of light near the entrance, a raider's torch illuminating the cave. One of them stepped inside, scanning the shadows with narrowed eyes. Connor raised his weapon, ready to act, but remained still, waiting for the right moment. Shylith held her breath, her entire body frozen in terror. The raider stepped closer, his torchlight sweeping across the walls, casting eerie shadows. Shylith could feel Connor's focus, his every movement calculated, his breathing steady. Just as the raider's light passed over their hiding spot, another voice called out from outside, shouting something in a harsh tone. The raider hesitated, glancing back toward the entrance. After a tense moment, he turned and left, muttering under his breath as he rejoined his companions. Shylith released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her entire body trembling from the near discovery. Connor waited a few moments, ensuring the raiders were gone before relaxing his stance. He looked back at her, his expression softening as he noticed her trembling. With a gentle hand, he reached out, his fingers brushing her shoulder in a reassuring gesture. The warmth of his touch seeped through her layers, calming her racing heart. Shylith met his gaze, her fear beginning to melt away, replaced by a growing sense of gratitude and admiration. Here was a being she had once feared as a monster, yet he was risking his life to protect her. She couldn't help but wonder what had brought him to Nyraxis and why he was willing to help a stranger in need. As the night wore on, they settled deeper into the cave, taking turns keeping watch. Shylith found herself observing him, marveling at his calm, almost noble demeanor. Despite her limited understanding of his language, she could see his character in his actions, brave, selfless, and, in a way, gentle. Her preconceived fears of humans began to fade, replaced by curiosity and a quiet respect for her unlikely protector. For the first time in days, Shylith allowed herself to close her eyes, feeling safe under his watchful presence. As she drifted into a light sleep, a strange thought crossed her mind, a thought that would have been unthinkable mere hours ago. Perhaps the stories her people told of humans were wrong. Chapter 3. Saving Shylith's People. Dawn broke over the frozen expanse of Nyraxis, casting a pale light over the jagged landscape. Shylith and Connor had traveled for hours under cover of darkness, navigating the harsh terrain with quiet determination. They were headed toward Shylith's village, what remained of it. Connor had insisted on helping her, and despite her lingering doubts, she could not deny the rising hope in her heart. As they approached the outskirts of her settlement, Shylith's heart sank. Smoke rose in thin, dark plumes from several houses, and the once vibrant marketplace lay in ruins, strewn with broken stalls and scattered belongings. Survivors huddled in small groups, their faces etched with despair and exhaustion. Shylith's family and friends were among them, their spirits crushed under the weight of loss. Connor took in the sight with a grim expression, his jaw clenched as he assessed the devastation. He placed a comforting hand on Shylith's shoulder, his gaze steady and reassuring. She managed a small, grateful nod, finding strength in his silent support. Before they could get too close, Connor gestured for her to crouch down, and they moved into the cover of a nearby thicket. Pulling out his device, a small, holographic map, he projected a faint display of the village layout. Shylith watched as he traced paths and marked areas where the raiders had left traces of their patrols. Though she didn't fully understand his methods, she recognized the careful, deliberate way he analyzed every detail. Connor turned to her, speaking softly. "We need to create a diversion," he said, though she could only understand his intent by his gestures. He pointed to the remains of a storage building and mimicked an explosion, then pointed to the raiders' encampment on the outskirts. Shylith caught on, nodding. Her people had hidden a few barrels of old combustibles. If they could be ignited, it might buy them enough time to evacuate the remaining villagers. Shylith explained this in broken words and gestures, and Connor's eyes lit up with understanding. Together, they set to work, moving carefully through the ruins to collect what they needed. Once they had rigged the combustibles, Connor took his place in a hidden vantage point overlooking the raiders' camp, his weapon ready. Shylith's heart pounded as she prepared to signal him. She was filled with fear, but also something new: determination. Her people had lived in fear of the raiders for too long, and with Connor's help, she saw a glimmer of hope that they might finally stand up and fight back. The signal was given, and with a sharp crack, the barrels exploded, sending flames and debris into the air. Shouts of alarm rose from the raiders' encampment as they scrambled to investigate the source of the explosion. Connor moved with swift precision, taking advantage of the chaos to pick off guards with his weapon, neutralizing threats before they could regroup. Shylith watched in awe as he fought, his movements graceful and efficient, each action calculated. The villagers, seeing the flames and hearing the chaos, began to emerge from hiding. At first, they were hesitant, but Shylith called to them, rallying their spirits. She spoke of Connor's bravery, of his willingness to help them despite being a stranger in their world. Inspired, the villagers began to join the fight, armed with whatever they could find: simple tools, broken pieces of wood, anything that could serve as a weapon. Together, they advanced toward the raiders, their fear giving way to newfound courage. Connor continued his assault, leading the charge with unwavering resolve. Shylith stayed close, guiding her people as they followed his lead. They used the cover of smoke and debris to advance, taking down the raiders one by one. It was a chaotic battle, but for the first time, the villagers had hope on their side. The tide turned as the raiders, caught off guard and outnumbered, began to retreat. Connor's skill and the villagers' determination proved too much for them, and one by one, they abandoned their posts, fleeing into the icy wilderness. Cheers erupted from the villagers as the last of the raiders disappeared over the horizon. But their victory was not without cost. Shylith's village was in ruins, and many of her people bore the scars of the battle. Still, the spirit of resilience was alive in their eyes, a spark that had been ignited by the bravery of a single stranger, a human, who had defied their fears and saved them when they had lost all hope. As the villagers gathered to tend to the wounded and assess the damage, Shylith found herself standing beside Connor, who was surveying the scene with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude and admiration. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Though her words were simple, the depth of her appreciation was clear. Connor nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. They spent the remainder of the day helping the villagers recover what they could. Connor showed Shylith and a few others how to use basic first aid techniques, sharing his knowledge with patience and care. The villagers were initially wary, but as they witnessed his kindness firsthand, their fear began to fade, replaced by curiosity and respect. As evening fell, the village elders approached Connor, their expressions somber but grateful. They bowed in thanks, offering him what little they had left in a gesture of gratitude. Connor declined their gifts, shaking his head with a warm smile. He didn't need words to convey his humility; his actions spoke volumes. Shylith watched the exchange with a swelling sense of pride. Connor had not only saved their lives but had given them the strength to reclaim their freedom. The villagers no longer saw him as a monster but as a hero, a protector who had defied the terrible tales of his kind. As they stood on the edge of the village, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape, Shylith felt a strange sense of peace. Connor's presence had shattered the fear that had gripped her heart, replacing it with something far more powerful, a bond forged through courage, trust, and sacrifice. She turned to him, a smile breaking across her face. "You. Different," she managed to say in his language, her words halting but sincere. Connor chuckled softly, nodding. Not all stories are true, he replied, his voice gentle. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a silent promise of his continued support. As the stars began to appear in the sky, Shylith felt a profound shift within her. She realized that her people's tales of humans, once a source of fear and dread, had been transformed. In Connor, she had found a friend, an ally, and perhaps something even deeper, a bond that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. And as they stood together, watching the remnants of the raiders' camp fade into the darkness, she knew that their story was far from over. A new chapter had begun, one where fear was no longer a barrier, but a bridge to understanding and unity. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. The fires from the battle had died down, and a calm silence settled over the village, punctuated only by the quiet murmur of voices as villagers regrouped and tended to their wounded. Shylith moved among them, offering comfort and checking on those she knew personally. Everywhere she went, she saw the signs of a hard-won victory, the resilience of her people, the shared nods of encouragement, and, more than once, glances toward the lone human who had made this victory possible. Connor worked tirelessly, showing the villagers how to set up temporary shelters and use his limited medical supplies to help those with more severe injuries. Though he was clearly exhausted, he didn't hesitate to share his skills and knowledge, his presence like a pillar of calm in the midst of their chaos. As the last of the wounded were settled, Shylith approached him, her heart filled with emotions she struggled to put into words. Over the past day, he had proven to be more than just a hero. He had shown her people a strength that went beyond physical might, a strength of spirit that she had never expected to find in someone from a race they had once feared. "Connor," she called softly, drawing his attention. He looked up, his expression gentle as he met her gaze. For a moment, they stood in silence, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Oh you," she managed, her words slow and careful. Though her grasp of his language was still limited, she wanted him to understand her gratitude. "Village safe. Because of you." Connor shook his head, a modest smile on his face. "You did this too, Shylith. Your people fought bravely. I was just here to help." His words, though unfamiliar to her, carried a warmth that she could feel in his tone. The villagers began to gather around them, the elders at the forefront, their faces etched with respect and reverence. One of the elder women, her back slightly bent with age, stepped forward, her voice strong despite her frailty. She spoke in Naraxi, addressing Connor with a gratitude that transcended their language barrier. Shylith translated, her voice filled with emotion as she conveyed the elder's words. "She says you have given us hope, something we had lost long ago," Shylith translated, her eyes glistening. "And you are always welcome here, as family?" Connor nodded, understanding the sentiment, even if he couldn't grasp each word. He bowed his head in acknowledgement, his own eyes reflecting a deep appreciation for the acceptance he had found in this distant world. As the days passed, Connor continued to work with the villagers, helping them rebuild and sharing what knowledge he could before his inevitable departure. Shylith found herself by his side often, learning from him and, in turn, sharing her own knowledge of Naraxi survival skills. Their bond grew stronger, and with it, the trust between their people. One evening, as they sat on a hill overlooking the village, Connor took out a small device from his pack, a beacon he had been using to send out distress signals in hopes of contacting a rescue ship. He held it up, gazing at it in contemplation before glancing at Shylith. "My people. They'll come for me soon," he said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and sadness. Shylith felt her heart tighten, the realization settling heavily upon her. She had known this day would come, but now that it was near, the thought of him leaving felt like an ache she hadn't anticipated. She nodded, struggling to find words that could capture the strange emotions swirling within her. "You. Go home," she said softly, forcing a smile. "Safe. Like you made us." Connor's face softened as he looked at her, and he reached out, taking her hand in his. "Shylith, you showed me a world I never imagined. You're brave, stronger than you know. I won't forget any of this." His words, though simple, resonated deeply, and Shylith felt a tear slip down her cheek, a rare expression of vulnerability among her people. They sat in silence, hand in hand, as the sun dipped below the icy horizon, casting a soft glow over the village below. Shyleth knew she would carry this memory with her, always a memory of an impossible friendship that had blossomed from the ashes of fear and mistrust. The following morning, a faint hum filled the air, growing louder as a sleek starship descended toward the village outskirts. The villagers gathered, watching in awe as the ship touched down, its lights gleaming against the snowy landscape. Connor stood with his pack slung over his shoulder, ready to return to the life he had left behind. As he approached the ship, he turned back one last time, his gaze searching for Shyleth. She stepped forward from the crowd, her heart pounding as she approached him. They stood facing each other, the enormity of the moment weighing heavily between them. Without hesitation, Shyleth extended her hand, mirroring the gesture he had used when they first met. Connor took it, his grip warm and steady, and she felt the strength of his presence, a presence that had brought hope and courage to her people. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with all the words she couldn't say. Connor's smile was bittersweet. "Take care of them, Shyleth. You're their hope now." With a final nod, he turned and boarded the ship, the doors closing behind him. As the engines roared to life, Shyleth watched the ship rise, carrying her friend back to the stars. She remained there, watching until the ship was a mere speck in the sky, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Back in the village, the people continued to rebuild, their spirits lifted by the memory of the human who had come to their aid in their darkest hour. Shyleth found herself at the center of their efforts, taking on a role of leadership she had never anticipated. She guided her people with the wisdom Connor had shared, helping them build a future free from fear. And though he was gone, his presence lingered in every act of kindness, every word of courage, and every moment of resilience. Connor's legacy lived on in the village of Nyraxis, where the memory of the carnivorous human who had come not to devour, but to protect, would be cherished for generations to come. As the stars filled the sky each night, Shyleth would gaze up, her heart filled with a quiet hope that somewhere out there, her friend was looking back, remembering her just as she remembered him. And in that hope, she found peace.